Okay, welcome back to episode 2 of the jump around. I don't know. I have to think of a better name. So I'm doing Pokemon again. I only played like 5 episodes of it, so it's been a while. I don't really remember what I was doing. So yeah, I'm jumping around. I just did Luigis Mansion. I think I'll do the show next. I don't want to... Or maybe I'll do a SNES game. Okay, I think I can do some notes today because this is kind of a Oh, Pikachu's dead. It's a nice, relaxing game. Not much going on, just pressing A a bunch. And I guess I probably already talked about it a lot in the first couple episodes. I don't know, it's tough. I don't want to spend... If I was going to play this game all the way through, it would be like 3 months worth of videos. I don't really want to do that. Spend that much time on one game. So I'm jumping around. I wouldn't mind playing Wind Waker all the way through, but nobody was watching that. There's somebody who watches for like 30 seconds and likes it every couple episodes, which is nice. Thanks for doing that. But that's all. I'm pretty much all I'm getting. It says I'm not getting that many impressions, which is probably... I don't know how to get more impressions, which is just how many people see your thumbnail. I don't know how to get more people to see. It was only like... Oh, I left the GameCube on. Oops. It was only like 30 impressions per video. So I guess it makes sense that like you only get 1 view per 30 impressions. That makes sense. Pounded me. Oh. Oops. I'll make it. I had a lot of notes. I started listening to the Quran. I don't really have that many notes about the Quran. I listened to the first 2 chapters, and I think there's 30 chapters. But it made me think a lot about the Bible, the New Testament and the Old Testament, and why just see them in a different light, I guess. The most interesting thing, I think, is... I guess I never realized how story-heavy or story-centric the Bible is. It seems dumb to say, but after reading the Quran, the first 2 chapters, there's no story. It's all just like... I mean, I know there are parts of the Old Testament that are laws and stuff. But nah, nobody likes those ones. the first two chapters of the Quran, they're kind of hard to get through because it's mostly just. It's hard to. It's very general about like God and certain things you're supposed to do, and if you don't do them, bad things happen. And God doesn't like that. If there's one thing I got out of it, it's you have to be in prudent fear, whatever that means. He says prudent fear like 50 times in the first two chapters. You must be in prudent fear. You don't go this way. Yep. Do I have cut? I think the reason why the Bible is in Christianity is the most popular religion in the world is because of how good the stories are and how well told they are. If you believe or not, I think it's hard to deny that the stories are good stories. Even if you don't believe, it's probably makes more sense for you that the stories are so good. That's why they stuck around so long. So obviously the New Testament is basically just the story of Jesus dying, coming back to life, redeeming, and all that great stuff. And there's also the story about Saul on the road to Damascus. Saul was like this terrible Christian killer, and then he gets blinded and he becomes Paul, and Paul's like the most important, he's pretty much the second most important Christian. He wrote over half of the New Testament. And so like the Quran is kind of, to me, I mean, I've only read the first two chapters. It's similar to Paul's letters, but without the story to preface it. So I think it's important to have that story to connect with Paul and who he was and what he's saying. And so I guess Muhammad wrote the whole Quran, but I don't know anything about him from reading it. He should have some kind of a story. Maybe they get to it later. Maybe it's starts in the middle and then it goes backwards. The Old Testament is the same way. A lot of stories. There's Noah, Daniel in the lion's den, Joseph in his coat. There's Jonah and the whale, Adam and Eve. It's very story-centric, and I just never thought about it that much. Our dad is not doing so good. I was thinking about it today. I think my favorite story from the Old Testament is Moses. That's probably everybody's favorite. They're the most like movies are made about Moses and the Egyptians and slavery and all that stuff. But I really like it. Did I say all my notes about? I guess I did have one note about the Quran. I don't want to be too critical of it or anything. I was expecting it. I had mentioned before, like, I was expecting to read it and be like, how could people read this and be so violent and be terrorists and so number one, I didn't really fully understand most of what I was listening to. Which I think is part of the problem, because it can be interpreted in a lot of different ways. If I couldn't understand it, then I'm sure people who grew up and maybe they don't have an education, or they maybe they might be illiterate, or I don't know. I'm not saying I'm like a genius or anything, but it was really dense and kind of wasn't focused. So you can, and there was some language in there that was a little bit harsher than I was expecting. Did I write anything down? There was a lot of mentioning of like, I should have switched. Whoops. I feel like it pretty much said, if there are people in the world who, it used the word desist, which I kind of didn't know what it meant. But it's like, you need to desist. There are people in the world sinning and they have to desist. And if they don't desist, maybe you kind of have to force them to desist because that's what God wants. And maybe if you have to kill them, you have to kill them. That's kind of how I was reading into that. And I know that most Muslim people don't believe that. And they don't interpret it that way, but it could be interpreted that way. And people do interpret it that way, I know. But I was expecting it to be, there's nothing in the New Testament that's really that directly like aggressive or like Jesus could be, I don't know, the whole New Testament is just about Jesus and who he was, and he was never really a very violent person. He never killed anybody. I mean, when the guard got his ear cut off, Jesus was like, don't do that. He put his ear back on. He never fought back against anybody. And we're supposed to be like Jesus, so it's hard to interpret in any way the New Testament to be like you have to hurt other people, or you have to do anything other than love your neighbor. And I'm a pretty low level. I'm gonna have trouble getting through this. The Old Testament is very violent. And the Quran is probably more similar to the Old Testament in that way, because the Israelites killed a lot of people and they destroyed a lot of cities. I guess Christians like me would rationalize that and say like, well, I mean, everybody did that, and they would have died if they didn't. So I mean, they didn't do anything terrible. It would have been nice if they didn't have to do those things, but they did. It just kind of bothered me. I never really liked the idea of like God choosing a people. I guess in my life I've tried different ways to interpret that to make me like it better, because it doesn't really make sense for God to choose the Israelites and then just want them to kill everybody else, and it doesn't make a lot of sense. I guess the way I interpret the chosen people is that God revealed himself to everybody on earth, and the Israelites are the only one who accepted him. I still don't like all the violent stuff, but so technically God chose them, but really it was the other way around. I wanted to talk about the Prince of Egypt, because I was thinking about that today, and I watched it a couple years ago, and I really liked it. I really like that story. It's a great story. I thought about naming the episode where I talked about the Quran. I thought about using a pun. So I was thinking of Quran. I was thinking, wait, is that disrespectful? It's weird that using a pun can be like sacrilegious or something, but it's like just a pun. But I decided not to. Quran. I don't know if I really have time. Maybe I'll do 2 episodes of this, and then I'll talk about... That's a good idea. I'll talk about Prince of Egypt in the next episode. I'm gonna get destroyed by Lieutenant Surge. I think that's kind of why I stopped, because I would have had to level a lot off screen. I was just kind of rushing through because I don't know. I didn't want to just wander around and record that. Oh, Jesus does talk about, I think the most similar to the Quran would be when Jesus talks about, there are some times when he's like, if you disobey God, you'll be thrown out with the gnashing of teeth. I forget exactly what he says. He says it like 5 times. Which is like, kind of like, if you don't listen to me, you'll go to hell. So, if you don't accept me, that's the most like negative Jesus gets. I'm not super. I've only read through the Old Testament pieces of it, and not in a while, and maybe not even the whole thing. I took an Old Testament class when I was in college. That's the last time I ever read through it. But I don't remember anything ever super like. I mean, it does tell you. Like, if your children disobey, you should stone them to death. Which I guess is pretty violent. But I don't know, Christians, I don't understand really why Jewish people today don't follow the law of the Old Testament. But I know why Christians do, obviously. It's because we don't have to follow the law, really. Paul says a lot of stuff about how he's more like metaphorical with what it means to follow the law. And he's like, Jesus came and he saved us, and he kind of does some logical reasoning where he's like, Jesus is here, he saved us, he died, so we don't we don't have to follow the law by following it the way it says in the Old Testament. I just read through the New Testament this year, but I kind of forget exactly. But it's like Jesus came back, and so we don't have to follow the Old Testament laws anymore. But like Jewish people, they don't eat pork, which is part of the law. But also they don't like, they don't stone their kids for disobeying them. I wonder how that works exactly. Don't die, don't die, don't die, don't die. I could ran so far away. Any other notes? I watched Aladdin on Sunday, and I liked it. The new one. I liked it more than I thought I would. It got pretty bad reviews, but I thought it was as good as it could have been. There's some stuff that obviously doesn't translate well to live action, which is mostly just the cartoony stuff, like Iago and Abu. They don't have too much to do because what are you going to do with like a real bird? You can't make too much of a character with like a bird or a monkey. But in the cartoon, Abu's like and Iago are they're like main characters. But in the movie, they didn't really know what to do with them. It's kind of cool that Iago turns into a giant monster at the end. I had rewatched the cartoon a couple years ago, and the main thing I didn't like was the ending. Because it does one of those endings where it's like, I mean, it's not terrible, but the Sultan's just like, Aladdin's like, what are we gonna do? The law still says like we can't get married, and then the Sultan's like, well, I'm the Sultan, I can just change the law, and then everybody's like, yay. It feels kind of cheap to just do that. Even though it still kind of works, because Aladdin kind of convinced the Sultan that he deserved to change the law, or that the law kind of deserved to be changed. So that kind of makes sense, but it still feels cheap. It's kind of silly when Aladdin's like, what are we gonna do? And the Sultan's like, oh yeah, I can just change the law. Well, couldn't you have just done that at the beginning of the movie? We wouldn't have to go through this whole thing. Yikes, he's level 21. So in the new Aladdin movie, they don't do that. They do this thing where the whole movie is about Jasmine kind of, she wants to be Sultan, and the Sultan's like, well, we just can't do that. That's not how it works. And then in the end, he decides that Jasmine can be the Sultan. And so she changes the law, which is better, and works better. I bet there are a lot of people who kind of don't like that. They would probably say like, well, that's not realistic, you know, and in history women weren't sultans, but it's like this is Agrabah. It's not a real place. I like the theory that Agrabah is like a post-apocalyptic future, and because the genie knows what, like, he knows pop culture references and stuff. Like, the last time he came out of his lamp was 1990, so that's why all of his references are, like, I don't know. I can't think of any references. Okay, that's a good place to stop, I think. I'll do one more Pokemon episode, which kind of goes against the whole jump around thing, but what are you gonna do? See you tomorrow. Still haven't figured out how to wave. Goodbye.